Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at a couple of Wrenn locos that have been sent in to me by a chap called Roy, and he wants them both restored to running order. It's quite apparent from opening the box lid that these Wrenn locos, although boxed, have suffered from damp and wet damage in the past. Although the models themselves don't look too bad, the instruction sheets included, but there's a lot of corrosion built up on the inside of that smoke deflector. The tender is in okay condition. The box is dry, it's just obviously been very wet in the past. Before we start the rebuild, let's have a quick look at this Wrenn instruction book that comes with these models. It's always nice when the original paperwork's included, and having a look through, there's an additional sheet there for Royal Scot and Bullied Pacifics, which is handy as these two models are both Battle of Britain class. Special notes on general running hints, there's lubrication points, and there's also two different styles of motor that require maintenance. As I said, both of these models are Battle of Britain class. We've got Fighter Pilot and Winston Churchill in the BR Brunswick Green. This whole video restoration will focus on Fighter Pilot, the light green one in the background, as the restoration for Winston Churchill was almost exactly the same. Any differences will be highlighted later on. Now, when I did a battery test on this model, as you will hear now, the motor was spinning but the wheels weren't going round. So we know the motor works and it's picking power up, but for some reason that middle grub screw has been released and the cog spins. Winston Churchill was a complete non-runner. The motor wasn't even attempting to spin on this one, so both of these locos are going to require a lot of attention. To disassemble these models is a simple screw under the smoke box there, and then you disengage a cab clip on the chassis, and the chassis comes away. These models are very heavy as the body is die-cast metal. It surprises me at this point that smoke box door handle there is actually a separate I'll get my teeth in, a separately fitted part. I thought it was part of the die casting. Now, taking a look at this model, it becomes apparent that even though the worm gear has been loosened, I cannot move those wheels. I'm going to completely strip this chassis down, so I'm also going to remove the front pony truck here by removing that rather large shouldered screw that allows it to turn around corners, and I'm going to remove the rear pony truck with an even larger screw. These older Wrenn and Hornby Dublo models, which is where Wrenn's pedigree lies, are very mechanical and all screwed together and are easy to maintain. It's interesting that screw, like I said, is loose, so it makes me wonder if some of the axles are seized on this model and that somebody in the past has loosened that screw so that the motor doesn't burn itself out. As you can see there, it is just spinning wildly. So to release the armature of these models, you have to release this retaining screw at the top here. There is a securing nut, but on this model it was quite loose, so I was able to undo it all with finger pressure only, as you can see. And this will release the armature, which simply pulls out the side. I also remove the magnet and magnet casing, as without removing these, you cannot take the armature out. These magnet casings are very handy, got an L and an R stamped into them, so you know which side of the motor they go to. One part of the process that wasn't featured in this video is the fact that when I disassembled these, both of these magnets were remagnetised in a remagnetising machine at my local model shop. Although the magnets are pretty strong as they are. These brush holders are a simple friction fit. You release that one there. There's the spring and the brush falls out. That brush is rather long and has got a lot of life left in it. And this brush retainer is actually insulated, although worryingly some of the insulating material seems to be coming away. So I gently pull the retainer out to reveal the brass spring, and again the brush was removed from this side. Now the armature is truly free to be removed. And although it has skipped a little bit there because I've actually taken the base plate off this model, the armature there, we'll put that aside for cleaning later. Now it becomes apparent that this rear axle is absolutely seized solid in the chassis block. This could be a problem with the damp that we mentioned earlier, so I'm going to give it a good cleaning out with contact cleaner, although that made very little difference. So I'm actually going to have to remove this wheel. So I gently prise out the crank pins there to remove the side rods off the wheel. And I'd have to do this on both sides, as I'm going to try and knock this axle out completely. As we saw earlier, the grub screws that hold the drive cog in place are already been loosened. And now that's all released, I can release the front mechanism and side rods and use this wheel puller, which clamps over the wheels and then uses a screw system onto the middle axle. And then basically you line it up. I'll try and get it on the camera there. You line up the clamps, the middle press goes on the axle, and then you gently turn the screw and it will pull the wheel off the axle. Although this time it left the plastic bushing on the axle, which was then removed with some fine nose pliers. Although they were in good condition and possibly fit for reuse, these plastic bushings were replaced. So now I'll gently wiggle that plastic bushing off there. The axle is still seized solid. So I got some wood and used the side of my workbench there, and I'm going to actually knock it through with a pin hammer and an old nail. I put the old nail on the axle and just gently tap it through. I didn't want to hammer blow the axle itself in case I misformed it. So using an old nail there allowed me to knock the axle out. And as you can see, that is absolutely coated in old grease and lubrication, which is why this was seized up. So again, I'm going to have to give this a thorough clean. This grease on here was a waxy finish. It really had dried out. And all these parts here are going to need thoroughly cleaning. Once I have taken it out once and freed it up, I gently put it back into the slot, and as you can see now, it starts to turn freely. So it was just seized up with that horrible lubrication. So using my usual cotton bud and methylated spirits method, initially I'm going to remove all the surface grease and grime off this chassis block. And I'm going to get in there in all the parts, and then once it's all gone off the cog, the axles and the chassis block, I give everything a thorough blast with that contact cleaner. And then leave it to dry before checking it over to make sure that all of the grease and grime has been removed. Now it's time to reassemble the wheel set now that everything's been cleaned off. And I'm going to just test fit it there, and it's spinning absolutely lovely and free. What a comparison to what it was when we started. So using some oil now, I'm going to make sure this is lubricated well so that it doesn't seize up in the future. I put a drop on the axle and a drop in the actual axle box. The cog was held in place with my tweezer nose pliers, and I just pushed the axle back through. It was very handy having two of these locos to work with, as Winston Churchill in the background there I used as a reference to get the cog in the correct position and the correct way round. Once that's all been manipulated back into its place, I re-tightened the grub screws on that cog to the axle, and the axle is now spinning nice and freely, and we can turn our attention to the other two drive axles of this model. These both again need a thorough clean, as the lubrication on these had also gone solid, but not as bad as the enclosed axle on the rear. And I also cleaned the wheel backs, as that helps conduct electricity through the pickups. Once I get the wheel orientation right on this model, which takes a minute, just to have it, there we go, get it right in the end. The wheels sit in and the cylinder blocks, etc., screw in back to the chassis block with this screw, and they also hold one of the wiring looms in place to aid pickup. This screw was tightened up. I usually say about over tightening screws, but I do find with these older models where the chassis and that is all metal, it is rather hard to over tighten them, as unlike plastic it doesn't have a lot of give in it. To reassemble the valve gear, the crank pins were just gently pushed home, and then the model was upended and all the axles were re-lubricated. To set the quartering correctly, I ensure that one side of the model all the wheels are in line and the side rods are straight. In this case I set them like that and then hold it up so that the wheels on this side are in the 6 o'clock position. A new plastic bushing was fitted to the axle, and then the wheel is pressed into place using gentle finger pressure. It is imperative that you get quartering correct on this, because if you don't, the model will not run. Incorrect quartering will lead to the loco jamming up. If you're unsure on how to do this or need a loco that needs this doing, it is better sending it off to somebody that's got experience in this sort of thing. Once the wheel was pressed on, the side rod there was replaced with its crank pin, and these again are a friction fit into the plastic mouldings of the wheels. And then just clearing a space on the workbench, I'm just going to give it a gentle roll test. And as you can see there, it's rolling lovely and freely, which means the axle has freed up and that the quartering is correct. The corrosion that was on the brass pickups, it was a green type corrosion from being damp, was removed with some 1200 grit wet and dry paper until the brass was nice and shiny, and then this was resoldered to the pickup wire. Although this was hard work, because by the time you'd soldered one on, the heat from soldering the second one on released the first. This was quite a fiddly job and took quite a while to do. But it's worth doing it properly so that this model has got some longevity left in it on its pickups. As you can see there, as I mentioned, one of the pickups fell off. But now the pickups are back in place and the chassis keeper plate is back in place. The wheels have been really well lubricated and the chassis runs freely. Now to clean up the armature, which is quite dirty, I use my fiberglass pencil to polish up the commutator, followed by a polish up with a cotton bud of methylated spirits, and then a shaved down toothpick was used in the gaps on the commutator, which on these models are really quite deep, and you'll see in a moment just how much carbon buildup there is in these. It is imperative you get all this out, otherwise you could end up, if it builds up too much, you will end up with a poor running model that can short circuit and overheat. Once I'd cleaned all the gaps out, one final polish with cotton bud and meths, and it was ready to go back into the model. Now this armature sits on a tiny little bearing cup in there which has got a ball bearing in it. So checking the ball bearing is still present, I add a small amount of oil in there because the original oil would have been washed away by the contact cleaner. And then the armature is gently manipulated back in place and the cog worm is lined up with the drive cog that was on the axle. Once that's in place, we can look at putting the retaining bearing back on the top. This also has a small brass bearing in it. A small ball bearing in there. So ensure that it is still there, put a little bit of oil on it, and then gently screw it down in place until you get the armature correctly lined up. Once it's all done, you can tighten that retaining screw up with a pair of long nose pliers. I then clean the magnet retainers, clean any carbon that's been built up on there over the years. Although on this model they were relatively clean, there was just a little bit of surface dust on them. And then the magnet and the magnet assembly was reassembled onto the chassis block. As I said earlier, these retainers have got left and right stamped on them, so you really can't go wrong in putting this back together. Here I am just tightening up that securing nut. Now I've adjusted the armature so that it's sitting correctly, and then the bolt to tighten up the magnet was all back in place, and the chassis is ready for a test run after we've cleaned and polished up the brushes and made sure that the springs and associated ironwork with the brushes is nice and clean to ensure good electrical conductivity. The springs and brushes on this model were in very good condition. The brushes had very little wear on them, so I don't think this model is suffering from high mileage. I just believe that the old lubrication going solid and that dampness has caused this to be a non-runner in the first place. The brush retainer was gently pushed home in each end of the motor there, ensuring that all the wiring is nice and neat. And then I'm going to give this a test, making sure there's power, and then just turning the controller knob up. You will see that when I touch it on there, the chassis is now running and all the axles are lovely and free. The quartering's correct as it's running nicely. And now I'm going to add some silicone grease to the worm gear and drive gears just to ensure that this model is properly lubricated so that it runs lovely for Roy for the next several years. Using a cocktail stick, I just put on a small amount onto the gears there. And all these parts on this model are metal. They will need lubrication, as if not they will wear down pretty quickly with high usage. I just run it there for a minute to get the lubrication to flow through the drivetrain and spread it about through those axles and through the cogs. Now I'm going to refit the front pony wheel and the rear pony bogie. These were simply put back on using the shouldered screws. Once they're in place, make sure that they turn correctly. And the chassis on this model is pretty much rebuilt. And I'm going to turn my attention to this corrosion on the inside of this smoke deflector. Using my old paintbrush, you can see on the desk there the old black paint was starting to flake off. And it's at this point that I notice on the body shell there are some blisters on the original Wrenn paintwork. So I have advised Roy to handle this model with care, as if it starts blistering too much, the model will need a full repaint. Just using some warm soapy water, I remove all the corrosion in there. And as you can see there next to the nameplate, that's one of the paint blisters, as is that. And there's also one on the other side. So hopefully when getting this out of that damp shed where these were stored, we've restored them and stopped that corrosion. Any chips to the black paintwork on this model were touched up with some rail match satin black paint, as you can see I'm doing here. And the inside of that smoke deflector was also repainted once all that green corrosion had been removed. You only need a small paintbrush, and my motto is with black paint, the less the better. It's easier to apply more black paint than it is take it off. Especially when you're working with a light livery like this bullied is in. You don't want any spilt black paint on the sides. Now that that's all done, I'm going to reattach the body to the chassis, and I must just say this is the next day when the paint has thoroughly dried. And to do that, you put the chassis clip in the back there and then re-secure it with this front securing screw that goes underneath the smoke box. Just tighten up the screw there. On reassembly for this model particular, I did find it easier to remove the plate at the back that formed the clip and just screw it back in after the chassis was in place. It may have been out of alignment slightly, but I just couldn't get the chassis in properly. One final job to do now it's been reassembled is to clean all the wheels, and I do this with my usual method of cleaning the wheel treads with my fiberglass pencil and then polishing them up with a cotton bud dipped in methylated spirits. And it was whilst doing the wheel cleaning on this model that Sarah, my wife, came out to the workshop with a problem of her own. So I'll leave you to watch that now. Why have you got one battery up one way and one the other?
That's what you should have.
Well, both when I opened it before, both batteries were the same way.
Oh, were they?
And I think, does that mean...
Both look like there's different ways. It tells you on the top, doesn't it, what way it needs to be up there?
Yeah, but didn't that...
Got a plus and a minus thing.
Right, you haven't took the sticker... Right, trash to track viewers, this is my wife trying to put batteries in here, look. She's not took the protective sticker off that one, so you've got plastic, and then she comes out wondering why it doesn't work. And this is why, viewers, she doesn't repair engines.
It's on the other one as well then.
This is what... Oh my God, it's on the other one as well. See, this is why, trash to track viewers, you never see Sarah mending an engine, because Sarah's series is coming out on YouTube soon. It's called Track to Trash, where she takes perfectly good working models. She would have a go at them and they would end up in the trash. So, right, now the stickers are off, look. I can't help it. I can't help it. Right. Now then, let's have a look at this. Oh, right. Now, do you think this little nationwide gadget is going to work now? Well, shit me, it works. Look at that. It's funny. Well, the person who invented insulating plastic can rest easy in his grave. And that is filming. That's going on the outtakes, that is. That is going on the outtakes, that is. Anyway, back to the model. And after I cleaned the main driving wheels, the front pony wheels and the rear pony truck bogie wheels were also cleaned to remove any built up carbon that had got on there over the years. So we're going to give it a track test now, and this model is now running nice, and it's a surprisingly good runner considering its age. These Wrenn models really do run nice and smooth if you maintain them well. So the tender of this model, the tender of Fighter Pilot, really didn't need anything doing to it other than a dust. It was just dusty. There was no paintwork missing, no parts missing, and the wheels on this were very clean. So now I'm going to turn my attention over to Winston Churchill, which again was a non-runner. And I've got a sneaky suspicion it's the same problem, but we'll have a look inside anyway. This won't be a thorough bit on this, as if you've got a Winston Churchill, just follow my instructions that I've just given you, as both of these models have exactly the same chassis. The reason I included it was because Winston Churchill may have had a different problem, so I thought I'd film it both together. And applying power direct there, the motor I could hear was buzzing, but there was no movement in it whatsoever. So again, this model was completely stripped down, as we did with the original. And on this one, the worm gear was absolutely caked in what looked like earwax. It was in fact grease that had gone virtually solid over the years, and that, as well as the axle again being seized solid, really didn't help the motor trying to run. And I am afraid to say that if we'd have tried to run that much more, we could have ended up burning the coils out and knackering the whole thing. But I've left this in, as you can see here. This has got a lot more dirt and grease in it than the previous Bullied we did. And again, after knocking out the wheels with the same method I did with the nail on that piece of wood, I put it back in after cleaning, and lo and behold, the rear wheel will now spin lovely and freely. So on both of these models, the non-running was caused by hardened grease that had got into the axles, and also, which had also been hampered by these models being stored in a damp shed. Here is the speeded up footage of me just reassembling Winston Churchill here, the Loco, not the great man himself. And there you just saw me lifting the other one up just as reference to put this one back together. The crank pins, wheels, the quartering was all done correctly. This magnet has already been remagnetised. And I just thought I'd include this. And then we'll look at the Winston Churchill chassis there. Lovely and free running after the complete rebuild. Although the armature on this one was sparking a little bit, but it's because I think I put the brushes in backwards, so they were basically fresh brushes at this point being ran in. After it was completely cleaned with wheels and that, it was given a quick bench test on a piece of track, and as you can see, it's gone from a non-running Bullied to a fully functioning one. I really do like these Wrenn Locos. They're good, well detailed for their time, and they are quite obtainable if you're not after a rare example. If you want a bulletproof Bullied, the Wrenn model really is quite good. I'm going to leave you now with a couple of shots of these Bullieds running around my son's DC layout. If you've got a Loco you'd like to see featured in an episode of Trash to Track, or anything that needs repairing, contact me on the email address on screen there, dansmodelrailways@gmail.com, and we'll have a look again. It's sent over, and it may even feature in a Trash to Track episode all of its own. Here you can see the slow running capabilities of the fighter pilot. But thanks again for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you again in the next video. Bye for now.